Hey everyone, welcome to the Deep Dive. So glad you could join us for today's exploration. And hey, before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss out on any future deep dives. All right, today we're diving into India-US relations. Whether you're prepping for the UPSC, specifically GS2, or you're a student just trying to wrap your head around international relations, or maybe you're just curious about this global partnership, this deep dive is for you. I mean, you've probably got a ton of articles, textbooks, and you're thinking, where do I even start? It's complicated, right? Long history, and it can be, honestly, a little overwhelming. But don't worry, we're going to break it all down. I've got an expert here with me who's going to help us, untangle everything from the early days when India and the U.S. were kind of suspicious of each other to, well, the strategic partnership we see today. And by the way, get ready for some surprises. Did you know that India actually has a trade surplus with the U.S.?
Yeah.
The U.S. isn't always on top. We'll unpack that. We'll talk about what it means for both countries.
And of course, we can't forget the Quad. You know that? Exclusive club of democracies that are trying to counter China's rise. We'll explore how India is navigating this whole geopolitical landscape, balancing things with the U.S., with China, even Russia. It's a high-stakes game. We're going to help you understand the moves. So buckle up. We're about to take a deep dive into India-U.S. relations.
You're right. It's a relationship full of twists and turns. It's not just formal stuff, diplomacy and treaties. It's also about ambition, anxiety, this constant push and pull between working together and kind of competing.
Okay, so let's rewind. How did this whole relationship begin? Was it smooth sailing from the start?
Not exactly. So, in those early years after India got its independence, the U.S. was a little, I guess, cautious. I mean, they liked that India was stable, but they were also kind of worried about, how much influence India was gaining in the region. And there were times, they even leaned more towards Pakistan to try and balance things out in South Asia.
So instead of welcoming India as an ally, they were playing this balancing game. What did that do to India, especially during the Cold War? I bet this is something our UPSC folks need to know.
It is. It's super important for understanding India's foreign policy. The U.S. and this whole balancing act, well, it kind of pushed India towards non-alignment during the Cold War. They didn't want to choose sides. And that idea of strategic autonomy, well, it's still a big part of their foreign policy, even today.
Okay, that makes sense. India wants to be friends with everyone, the U.S., Russia, even China, to a point, right?
Yeah.
But then how did we go from this cautious dance to the global strategic partnership that we see now?
Well, a bunch of things happened. One big one was India's economy. It took off. The U.S. started to see India as, an economic powerhouse, a valuable partner.
So it became hey, India has something we want, but it wasn't just about money, right?
Oh, definitely not. I mean, shared worries also played a role. 9/11, for example, really changed things. Both India and the U.S. realized they had this, common enemy, terrorism, and that brought them closer. And then, of course, there's the big thing, China.
China.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like everything leads back to China these days. How did China's rise affect things?
It's like this. Imagine India as a tightrope walker, trying to, stay balanced between the U.S. and China. One wrong step, and things get really messy. China's becoming more assertive, and that's made India's tightrope walk even harder.
So they're looking for someone to hold their hand on that tightrope, and that's the U.S.
In a lot of ways, yes. They both see China's ambitions as a problem, a challenge. That shared concern is a big reason they're becoming such close partners.
That makes sense. Now, I got to admit, when I was going through your research, I was surprised to learn that India has a trade surplus with the U.S. I mean, isn't the U.S. supposed to be the economic giant? Help me understand this.
Yeah, a lot of people are surprised by that. It even causes some friction sometimes. The U.S. invests a lot in India, but Indian companies are doing really well in the U.S. market too. I mean, India's a major exporter now. Things like, pharmaceuticals, IT services, even manufactured goods.
So it's not just about outsourcing anymore. India is actually competing with the U.S. in some areas. That's a big deal, especially if you're trying to keep up with the global economy.
It is, and it's definitely been a point of tension sometimes, especially when it comes to trade deals and intellectual property rights.
So we've got this interesting dynamic, strategic partners who are also kind of economic rivals. Where do they actually cooperate economically?
Well, besides the trade in goods and services we just talked about, defense is huge.
Yeah.
The U.S. is India's second biggest weapons supplier, which says a lot. And they're working more together on energy, too. India's buying crude oil and, LNG from the U.S.
So even with a trade surplus, India is still buying a lot from the U.S., especially when it comes to defense. That shows, like, a lot of trust, right?
Definitely. And it's not just about buying and selling. They're also collaborating on things like, clean energy and new technology.
It's a pretty complex relationship, it seems, cooperation and competition. But no relationship is perfect, right?
Yeah.
Where do things get, like, a little rough between India and the U.S.?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some sticking points. The U.S. has been pretty vocal about, some of India's trade barriers and a few of their domestic policies. And India, well, they've raised concerns about, like, U.S. protectionism and those visa restrictions, especially the ones that affect Indian professionals working in the U.S.
Visas. That's a big one for a lot of our listeners, students who want to study or work in the U.S.
Definitely a hot topic. The H-1B and H-4 visas, which are super important for Indian professionals and their families, have been like a constant source of debate. And then there were those U.S. sanctions on Iran, which really impacted India's energy imports.
So even as they're getting closer strategically, they're still dealing with these practical, everyday issues that affect people. It's almost like they're trying to, do a tango in hiking boots.
I like that analogy. It captures the relationship perfectly. It's a balancing act, trying to manage their strategic goals and, the realities of domestic politics and economic interests.
Speaking of domestic politics, how did Biden becoming president change things? Was it a big shift from the Trump years?
The Biden administration, well, they've taken a more, I guess you could say, conciliatory approach, more emphasis on diplomacy and like working with other countries. There's this renewed focus on things like climate change and global health, where there's potential for more collaboration. And they've said they're willing to ease some of those visa restrictions that got tighter under the previous administration.
So like a bit of a reset, but thinking bigger, what do you see in your research that will shape the relationship going forward, beyond Biden?
Well, one thing that's pretty clear is that the defense partnership is going to get even stronger. They've signed some really important agreements like LAMOA, COMCASA, and BECA. Basically, it means they can share bases, intel, and communicate more securely. It's a huge change, from the Cold War, and it could mean they do joint military operations in the future.
Closer military ties. Got it. But what about the areas where they don't always agree? How are they handling that?
They're both kind of learning to manage those differences and focus on the bigger picture. The U.S. gets India's concerns about China, and they're helping India modernize its military. And India's becoming more assertive, about what it wants on the world stage.
Sounds like they're both like maturing in the relationship, understand each other's needs and limits.
Yeah.
But they both have their own agendas, right?
Absolutely. They're two ambitious powers, each with their own strengths and, complications.
And speaking of complications, we can't forget the Quad. It's like the cool kids club of geopolitics. But is it just talk, or is there something real there?
The Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, is definitely getting a lot of attention. It's this informal group where India, the U.S., Japan, and Australia get together to, talk strategy in the Indo-Pacific region.
So like a brainstorming session for dealing with China. But how much can they really do? Does it actually have any power?
It's still early, but it sends a pretty clear message to China, that these democracies are serious about a free and open Indo-Pacific. They're cooperating on things like maritime security, infrastructure, even vaccines.
So it's not just about, showing off their military. They're trying to offer a real alternative to China. But hasn't India been kind of hesitant about, like, fully embracing the Quad?
That goes back to India's strategic autonomy idea. They don't want to be seen as, like, too close to one side, and they want to be able to, make their own moves.
Like they're playing 3D chess, keeping all their options open.
Exactly. It's a fascinating game, and it's going to have a big impact on how the 21st century unfolds.
Yeah, it's a game with high stakes. And it's not just geopolitics, right? We're talking about visas, economic competition, even those Iranian sanctions. It feels like this relationship affects so many parts of our lives.
It definitely does. And sometimes, those everyday things clash with the big strategic plans.
Exactly. So let's focus on those pressure points for a bit.
Yeah.
You said the U.S. has concerns about some of India's domestic policies. What are they talking about specifically?
Well, the U.S. has been critical of what they see as like a decline in democracy in India. They're worried about freedom of the press, minority rights, and the use of certain laws that some people say are being used to, silence dissent.
So even though they're strategic partners, the U.S. isn't afraid to criticize India on those things. Is that causing friction?
It definitely creates some tension. India sees these criticisms as, interference in their own affairs. They argue that the U.S. doesn't really understand how complex Indian society is.
It's like that friend who gives you advice you didn't ask for, right?
Hmm.
Maybe they mean well, but it's not always welcome.
That's a good way to put it. And it's not just about, lectures on democracy. There's also the whole issue of India's relationship with Russia.
Ah, right, the other big elephant in the room. India buys a lot of weapons from Russia, and the U.S. hasn't been happy about that, especially since the war in Ukraine started. How are they managing that, that tricky triangle?
It's a delicate balancing act. India has had ties with Russia for a long time, and they see Russia as essential for their defense. They haven't given in to pressure from the U.S. to break things off with Moscow. They say they have the right to choose their own security partners.
Yeah, that makes sense from India's perspective. They don't want to be told who they can and can't be friends with. But it must be frustrating for the U.S., especially when they're trying to, like, show a united front against Russia.
It definitely makes the relationship more complicated, but both sides seem to understand that they can't control each other and are trying to find ways to, work around these differences.
So we're back to that tango in hiking boots analogy.
Yeah.
2 steps forward, 1 step back. But overall, do you think the relationship is moving in a good direction?
I think it's mostly positive. Both sides are starting to realize that this partnership could really change the world. They're both investing a lot in it, and there's a real desire to, overcome the obstacles.
That's good to hear. But let's be real. What are the biggest challenges they're going to face in the next few years? What should our listeners, keep an eye on?
Well, one big thing is managing that economic rivalry. As India's economy keeps growing, there's going to be more competition between them in key areas.
So those trade tensions aren't going away anytime soon. What about China? How will that play into all of this?
China's is definitely going to be the biggest strategic challenge for both of them. The competition for influence in the Indo-Pacific is heating up, and there's always a chance that someone will miscalculate or things could escalate.
So that tightrope walk is only going to get harder.
Okay.
What about India's domestic politics? Could that mess things up?
It's something to think about, for sure. India's political scene is always changing, and there are people in India who are wary of getting too close to the U.S. They see the U.S. as, an unreliable partner and worry about getting dragged into America's conflicts.
That's a valid concern, considering the U.S. history of interventions around the world.
Yeah.
But even with all these challenges, it sounds like both India and the U.S. are committed to making this partnership work.
I think that's right. They both understand how important this relationship is strategically, and they're willing to put in the work to build trust and, understanding.
So it's not just a casual friendship. It's strategic, built on shared interests and the realization that they need each other in this crazy, complex world.
Exactly. And that takes us back to strategic autonomy, which we talked about earlier. India is determined to make its own way in the world, and they see this partnership with the U.S. as a way to, have more options, not to become subservient to America.
Like they're saying, we'll dance with you, but we're leading.
That's a great way to put it. India's not going to be anyone's sidekick. They're a rising power with their own goals, and they're going to have a big impact on the 21st century.
So for our listeners, especially those UPSC folks who are trying to understand all the ins and outs of international relations, what's the main takeaway here?
The main takeaway is that India-U.S. relations are dynamic, complicated, and always changing. It's a relationship that's shaped by both shared interests and strategic calculations, and it's going to have a huge impact on the world.
It's definitely a relationship worth watching closely. And even for those of us who aren't, aspiring diplomats, it's interesting to see how these two big players are figuring out how to, get along and work together in this world where power is spread out.
It's a story that's still being written, full of intrigue, challenges, and possibilities.
Speaking of possibilities, let's talk about the future of this relationship. Where do you see things going in the next decade or so?
I think the defense and security partnership will keep growing. The Quad will probably become more formal and influential, and we'll probably see more joint military exercises and intelligence sharing between India and the U.S.
So closer military ties, for sure. But what about the economic side of things? Will those tensions ease up, or are we in for more trade wars and disagreements?
The economic relationship will probably stay complicated. There'll be areas where they cooperate, especially in things like technology and renewable energy, but there will also be competition and friction.
Kind of a love-hate relationship. But what about those softer parts of the relationship, like people-to-people ties? How are those evolving?
People-to-people ties are actually a really strong point. There are millions of Indian Americans who are playing a crucial role in, connecting the two countries. There are strong educational and cultural exchanges, and there's a growing sense of familiarity and understanding between the two societies.
That's nice to hear. It reminds us that even with all the geopolitics and strategic thinking, there are real human connections that bring these two countries together. But at the end of the day, they're both going to prioritize their own interests, right?
Of course, India and the U.S. are both sovereign nations with their own priorities. The key is that they're learning to accommodate each other's interests while still going after their own goals.
It's like they're realizing that they can kind of have it both ways. They can be friends and rivals at the same time.
Exactly. It's a nuanced and sophisticated relationship, and it's one that needs constant tweaking and adjusting.
So it's not a simple good guys versus bad guys situation. It's a complex mix of cooperation, competition, and shared interests.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so interesting to study and analyze.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of unraveling that complexity today. We've covered a lot, from the history of the relationship to what's happening now and what might happen in the future.
It's been great to dive deep into this topic with you.
The pleasure's all mine. And for our listeners, I hope this deep dive has helped you understand this important relationship and how it affects the world a little better.
It's a relationship worth keeping an eye on, that's for sure.
Absolutely. It's a relationship that's going to shape, global politics, economics, even our daily lives in the years to come.
Yeah.
But it's not just about these two big players, right? What happens between India and the U.S. has an impact on the whole world. It affects things like stability in Asia, the fight against climate change, stuff like that.
You're right. It's not just a relationship between two countries. It's a big part of what's happening globally. It's constantly changing because of events, both close by and far away.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for everyone to understand, right? Whether you're training to be a diplomat or just a regular person trying to make sense of the world. So for anyone who's just starting to learn about international relations, especially those UPSC folks who are studying hard, what advice would you give them? How can they stay ahead of the game and really understand this complex relationship?
My advice: go beyond the headlines. Don't just, focus on the latest deal or disagreement. Look deeper, into the history, the culture, the economic stuff that's shaping the relationship.
So it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Always something more to discover.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to, question what you think you know. Things aren't always so simple in international relations. There are a lot of nuances, and understanding those nuances is really important for understanding the world.
That's great advice. It's a good reminder that learning about this stuff isn't just about, memorizing facts. It's about thinking critically and learning to see the world from different perspectives. And that's what we've tried to do today, in this deep dive. We've looked at the history, the challenges, the opportunities, and the human stories that are all part of this relationship between India and the U.S. We've talked about so much: strategic partnerships, trade wars, visas, even cultural exchanges. I know it's a lot, but I hope you've, come away from this deep dive with a better understanding of international relations, how complex they are and what's shaping our world. And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to learn out there. So keep reading, keep asking questions, and keep thinking about these important issues. A big thank you to our expert for sharing your insights and guiding us through all of this.
It was my pleasure. I always enjoy these deep dives, and I'm glad we could, shed some light on this fascinating relationship that keeps changing.
And to all of you listening, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope you found this episode informative and interesting. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss our future episodes. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into, a world of knowledge. Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.